G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 2 of Big Ideas investigation into what's happening in the Ukraine. Recording this for Laura Leela in Cornwall because she asked, what does everybody know about the Ukraine and how much attention is anybody paying? Well, this is what we know in Australia, mate.
Countries which do not accept the notion of near abroad, that is, a degree of hegemonic recognition of hegemonic power of Russia. In case of Nagorno-Karabakh, in case of Southern Ossetia, Abkhazia, the Russians discreetly encouraged secessionist movements in part of the countries to penalize them for not recognizing the hegemonic domination. And they managed to do it effectively. There is a real danger that the Russian intervention will not take a form of bringing troops, that it's unlikely, but rather encouraging internal secessionist movements. The reports in Poland, where I spent last half a year, all the time emphasized that in Donetsk they started printing the passports of the Donetsk Republic already as a threat to Ukrainian authorities that one of the sanctions would be dismembering Ukraine. In Crimea, there were well-publicized numerous reports of citizens organizing themselves and petitioning the Russian authorities to intervene there, to provide, to defend their rights. These are real dangers which I think everyone should keep in mind. There are different ways of dealing with this danger, but that's one of the challenges for the Ukrainian oppositional movement, not allow for dismembering, because that would cause civil war.
Marco, do you want to...
Very briefly,
yes?
You asked how important is Europe for the people on the Maidan. It seems to me that the issues on the Maidan have long ago gone well beyond the question of membership, technical, formal relations with the European Union. They're about a much more basic struggle between a disgruntled, unhappy, offended population and a government which is perceived as not representing their interests, as a government which is in fact an enemy of the people. I'll simply add the remark that after the Orange Revolution, the European Union lost a great opportunity by steadfastly refusing to offer Ukraine even the modicum of a hope of ultimate accession to the European Union. In fact, a great deal of effort was expended in creating a kind of zone into which to put the countries that wouldn't be expected to join. And the Eastern Partnership and the neighborhood policy of the European Union were, I fear, designed largely with this in mind.
You haven't heard Les Holmes speak very much right now, but you are going to hear him a lot more now. So it is said that one of the factors leading to the current unrest in Ukraine is the public's growing intolerance of corruption there. Is this true? And if so, is it possible to compare the corruption situation in Ukraine with that in other countries? In other words, is it any worse there than elsewhere?
Firstly, in terms of the emphasis Natalie and others have put on the rule of law, corruption definitely is one of the elements of that. I mean, every country has corruption. We have corruption in this country. The big difference is that here we do something about it most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. To give you one or two examples of what upset Ukrainians, the leading international organization for measuring corruption and for publicizing it in the world is Transparency International. And back in 2004, so exactly 10 years ago, ironically in the same year as the Orange Revolution, they produced a list of the world's 10 most corrupt politicians. They were mostly in Asia, Africa and Latin America, but there was one European, and that was Pavel Lazarenko, who had been the Ukrainian Prime Minister in the mid-1990s. He's now sitting in jail, and I don't think they've let him out in the United States. Bringing it much more up to date, Transparency International produces what they call a Corruption Perception Index every year, and the latest one is the 2013 one, which came out very late last year in December. And Transparency International called Ukraine the most corrupt country in Europe. Now, Ukrainians wouldn't have been surprised at that. They might have been upset at that, but they wouldn't have been surprised. And an even more recent example of how upset they were and how important this issue is to so many Ukrainians is that I have to go back to December. In December, Lenin was toppled from, a statue of Lenin was toppled from a plinth. And for a little while, a couple of months, that plinth was empty. And then in early February, just about 2 weeks ago, there was a new symbol on that. Lenin was replaced by a golden lavatory. The symbolism of this is not just we're going down the toilet, but actually the fact that Dacia, the country estate of Yanukovych, is said to have gold lavatories. I don't know if that's true or not. And the other place that was targeted when they put up the toilet was the Deutsche Bank, the German bank, because they said that they are assisting corrupt Ukrainian officials to stash their money away. So that's one thing. You asked me about measuring. There's no way anyone in the world can produce very definitive figures on corruption. But the two main ways we look at it are through perception surveys. In other words, asking people, do you think corruption's getting worse, getting better? Where do you think the corruption is most concentrated and so on? And experiential surveys where you ask people, have you actually paid a bribe? And back in the mid-1990s when they started both of these surveys, well, particularly the experiential one came at the end of the 1990s, the perceptual surveys, people started saying, well, that's all very well, but your perception can be based on something that's totally unreal. And I have an answer to that, which is that perception is a form of reality. We make decisions on the basis of our perceptions. You know, whether to invest, for instance, in a country can inter alia be related to our perception of how corrupt it is. But in any case, in order to address that charge that perceptions could be out of kilter with reality, people started running experiential surveys, and initially skeptics said, no one will ever answer these questions. Well, let me give you the figures. First, I'll give you the latest Ukrainian perception figures, and then I'll give you the latest Ukrainian experiential questions. In other words, the questions, have you paid a bribe to various groups in the last 12 months? Firstly, perception. I mentioned the Corruption Perceptions Index, but there's one that I actually prefer called the Global Corruption Barometer. It's all free, all readily available online. So in the 2013, the most recent Global Corruption Barometer, Ukrainians, about 1,000 respondents there, scientifically chosen, selected. Over the past 2 years, how's the level of corruption in Ukraine changed? 1% said it's decreased a lot. 36% said it's stayed the same. 16% said it increased a little. And 43% said it increased a lot. So if you add those together, you've got 1% saying it's decreased, 36% saying it's stayed the same, and nearly 60% saying it's increased a lot. They were then asked, well, where do you think the corruption is worst? Religious bodies, even this is high, one would think, for religious bodies. 37% of Ukrainians thought it was bad there. 42% in NGOs, military 52%, education system 69%, political parties 74%, parliament legislature 77%, public officials and civil servants 82% of respondents said that was highly corrupt, the police 84%, and worst of all, the judiciary 87%. Okay, well, that's perceptions, and I've already said that perception is a form of reality because people make decisions on it. But let's ask now, which branch of the state are most corrupt in terms of your actual experience? So the question asked of the respondents was this: have you or anyone in your household paid a bribe to one of these 8 services in the last 12 months? The overall figure, the overall number of Ukrainians, and there are about 1,000, saying that they or a member of their household had paid a bribe, was 37%. And that compared with a much lower figure, a lower figure in Russia of about 25%. I have to be honest, that was in 2012. The Russians didn't allow that question to be asked in 2013 because they know the figures going up. Here are the statistics. In the last 12 months, either I or someone in my household has paid to utilities 6%, to the tax office 18%, to registry and permit services, getting a permit to build a house, for instance, 22%, Land services 25%. The judiciary actually was only 21%. Sorry, I should have pointed out that this is if you've actually come into contact with these agencies, not everybody. Education 33%, medical and health services 41%, and the star performer, police 49%. 49% of those who come into contact with the police are paid a bribe. What's causing it? There's all sorts of things, communist legacy, the economic situation, and actually unemployment, if the figures are to be believed, is not that bad. But the GDP per capita in Ukraine is very low, very, very low, much lower than Russia, for instance. There is a real problem with corruption in Russia. Russia is generally said to have the highest rate of corruption of a country for its level of economic development. But Ukraine is worse in the sense that both more people say they're paying bribes and they've got a much worse economic situation. The GDP per capita in Russia is more than 3 times higher than the Ukrainian. There are other aspects. The lack of transparency. I mean, if you want to keep corruption levels high, you keep transparency low. And Ukraine is often taken as an example of a country, by many it's taken as the example of a country with defamation laws that so favour the person being accused of corruption. I know at least a couple of newspapers that have gone to the wall in Ukraine because they'd made allegations of corruption. They weren't found to be 110% provable, and they were fined so much that they went to the wall. About culture, I'm always very nervous about placing too much emphasis on culture. I think from what Marco was saying about Huntington's cultural line, which of course he got from William Wallace in Oxford, it wasn't Huntington's own, which he acknowledges, it wasn't plagiarised, but a Harvard professor getting it from an Oxford professor. That cultural line has to be treated with extreme caution. I'm not saying culture doesn't come into it. I think there are cultural differences. What I would say, though, is that there is another former Soviet country which had a huge problem with corruption and where political will of the leader led to a dramatic, and I mean dramatic, drop in corruption levels. Georgia, we've got all the, those figures I gave you. You can get the same for Georgia, and if you look at the pre-2004 and then the post-2004 figures, you will see that everyday corruption has gone down. Now I said earlier that experiential surveys are not the be-all and end-all, and one of the reasons is that they don't capture high-level corruption. If you're asking people, did you pay a bribe? Well, most people don't come into contact with their MP or even high-level, ministers and so on. And so take perception and experimental survey results together and you're getting somewhere. But Georgia shows that even a country with an alleged high-level culture of corruption, it can be reduced. Singapore and Georgia are 2 countries in the world that have shown corruption can be brought down. But you've got to get, for instance, the oligarchs on side. Now, the oligarchs, you've been asking about how to resolve this issue. There's no question we need a change in the political system. We need a change in implementing the 2004 constitutional amendment, which would take power from the president and move it more towards Parliament. These are measures, but another very instant measure that could be taken is for the oligarchs to play a much more positive role. And they seem to be realising, it's suddenly dawned on them with a dramatic decline in the value of the currency, that they themselves will be losing billions if they don't get the economic situation under control. So the economic leverage within Ukraine must be mentioned, as well as economic leverage from Russia and EU.
My next question is to Stefan Romano. So after several weeks of non-violent standoff between protesters and government forces, the situation, as we all know, has become violent, with several deaths and hundreds of injuries. What does the latest violence mean for any possibility of progress towards an understanding between the 2 sides?
At the moment, I really don't see there is any goodwill. There is constant pressure. There is constant denial that there's a problem. Ultimately, in a normal country, somebody would be held accountable. So if you go through what the media is saying now, it's everybody else's fault except the government. But let me just say, in terms of resolution, let's just go back a little bit. You know, when Maidan started, the first Maidan was the students' Maidan. It was a Maidan that started on Maidan ologists. Before, not long after that, there was another Maidan which the politicians decided that they would organise, and that was on the Europejska Ploshcha. After some convincing, they realised that there should be one Maidan, and they came back to Maidan ologists. After the beatings on the 29th and 30th, there was another mini Maidan created at Mikhailivska Ploshcha. Each one of these Maidanes started to form its own opinion about what should happen. So the constant question was, you know, everybody said, do Kinshasa, do Peremai, you know. So what does the Kinshasa mean? Does it mean the impeachment of the president? Does it mean presidential elections? So the conversation from Maidan has been, well, what is it that we ultimately want? Now, one of the biggest problems is articulating what is it that we want as a group. And I mentioned before, in terms of the political spectrum has its own outcomes that it wants because it has a political future. So if those three people don't deliver on something in the next few days, I would say their political future is just about gone. The question is, what happens then? Some of the demands were, they started with the demands were, we have to free all those that have been incarcerated. And the freedom meant what? I mean, a lot of people were arrested. You know, here you get arrested, you get booked, you get a summons, and you wait for the court case. Well, over there it's a bit different. You pay the bribe and you sit there as long as the bribe's not paid. If it's not enough paid, well, you sit for as long as you have to wait. They'll sit there. In the meeting with Kluyer said, oh, what we'll do is we'll do away with home arrests, because home arrests was going to be the next thing, so we'll do away with home arrests. We're talking about high-level here thing. What I'd like you to do is put yourself in the shoes of those million people, not the echelon, but the million people who are looking at a future, those guys who are today picking up those bricks and throwing them, and what do they want? So it started with pretty basic. Let's free people. Let's make sure that all the charges are dropped. There will be an amnesty. Then there was the draconian laws of the 16th, the dictatorship laws. We will refute those. They came down. But they all came with conditions. The government obviously wanted maximum. And Maidan said, no, well, you know, you give a bit. And you know, the interesting thing is that until Butulov, the person who was heading the Alta Maidan, until that scenario, there was a scenario painted on Vulitsa Hrushelskoho. In other words, that street that you saw near Kiev Dynamo where all the excitement happened on January the 22nd. There was a solution, and the solution was, you know what we'll do is you go this way, they'll go that way, and somehow we'll show the people that there's dialogue. But as soon as Butulov affair happened, and then Kozhara in Germany said, well, that's a lot of nonsense. He denied that even happened. That really infuriated people. So, again, you take one step forward, you take two steps back. Then there was the issue of amnesties. Okay, so we have amnesty, you let something go. The Kiev administration building was signed over, Hrushelskoho was passed over, and everybody looked like, okay, well, let's continue the dialogue. So the dialogue ended up on what? So what's achievable? Now, are you going to impeach the president within 3 weeks? Well, you're not. Are you going to get president election in a week? You're not. Okay? So basically what people started to say was, let's start with the constitutional change. If we can get the constitutional change, then we can get lots of other things to happen. You presume that everybody's coming at it from more or less the same direction. But then you have a situation even within the opposition in terms of constitutional change. You have one group saying, well, we won't accept this, we won't accept that. One of the things that people speak about in Ukraine is bringing the temperature down. Today, what's the point of having a conversation? You know, people are pretty hot, on both sides are pretty hot-headed. So you've got to bring the temperature down. Again, you've got this stalemate. So if you want to change constitutional change, first you've got to be able to talk. Now, the party leaders yesterday didn't even want to talk. Now, what do we do? I don't have all the answers. I don't have any of the answers. But I think that international intervention, international pressure is something that really now has to come into play. When Yatsenyuk and Klitschko came back from Germany a couple of weeks ago, they made some statements about there will be a tribunal, there was going to be this, and we've negotiated this. The problem, though, is when you say we're going to do something, it doesn't happen, two things happen. One, there's disenchantment on the ground, but what does it say to Yanukovych? And I think now it is high time. I mean, we've been lobbying the Australian government. I mean, the Australian government, you know, has been pretty poor in all this in terms of making a statement. I mean, they did two things. We went to see Julie Bishop's chief of staff. The next day they put a release out. On December the 11th, we went to see them again. They said, oh, look, we've just called in the charge d'affaires. We're doing this on government to government. We're saying we condemn, we don't want the violence, you've got to find a solution. And also, because we had said to the government some time ago that we understood that Yanukovych wanted to come to Australia, that what they should do is not accept the official visit. And they told them as much, that you can come, but you will not be hosted by Australia. Now, Can Australia play a big role? It's like building blocks. Every bit of help now is required, but I think you need a circuit breaker. Just following what's happening now, I just don't see at the moment a circuit breaker, because when you look at who could be the circuit breakers, well, forget the president. He's not interested in anything. His administration is obviously now worried because of what's happened, and again, it goes back to what I said before about now who's going to take responsibility for all this, and who else can be a circuit breaker? The opposition itself's got to get itself organised. I don't know how they play. The community sector plays, 0.00000 role in all this, because all the decisions are made somewhere else. All we can do from the community sector is reinforce what we hear from our governments.
That was Dr. Natalie Doyle, Deputy Director of the Monash European and EU Centre, Professor Leslie Holmes from the University of Melbourne, Jan Pakulski, Professor of Sociology at the University of Tasmania and President of the Australian Institute of Polish Affairs, Professor Marko Pavlichin, Director of the Mykola Zirov Centre for Ukrainian Studies, and Stefan Romanov, Chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations and Secretary-General of the World Congress of Ukrainians, and Chair Professor Pascaline Vinand, Director of the Monash European and EU Centre. That discussion presented by the European and EU Centre and the Mykola Zirov Centre for Ukrainian Studies at Monash University. To find out how significant the dismissal of President Yanukovych was, earlier today I spoke to Marko Pavlichin.
Very significant indeed. It signifies that the main goal of the protesters on the Maidan has been achieved. The symbolic goal of removing the president who presided over a government that rode roughshod over human rights and was prepared to use extreme violence against the citizens of its own country. The longer-term significance of this is hard to judge, because at the moment, of course, the country stands in front of very complex political and economic challenges. The political challenge is to reinvent the political system from the ground up, trying to generate true democracy, a mechanism that actually represents the needs and aspirations of the people in their legislature and in their executive government. This is no simple matter given the tradition of corruption and of self-serving, egotistical politics that has established itself over the last decade. The economic challenge, of course, is the one that is familiar to us. The country is on the brink of bankruptcy, and it needs to draw away from that very considerable external assistance to do that, and the extent to which that will be forthcoming from various structures of the EU and the West is open to question at this moment.
So what you're saying, in short, is the dismissal of the president doesn't resolve many of the deep underlying issues in the Ukraine.
Exactly. Those issues, in fact, that are discussed at some length in the round table at Monash University that happened before the dramatic resolution of the standoff between the protesters and the government.
And the Ukraine obviously is still in the midst of this tug of war between Europe and Russia. That hasn't changed. How do you think Russia will respond to these developments?
Well, Russia has already indicated how it will respond to these developments. Foreign Minister Lavrov has been issuing statements in which the protesters are described in extremely negative terms, essentially as hooligans, terrorists, rioters. And it's clear that Russia is not going to welcome the opportunity of cooperating with the new government in Ukraine. There have been other signals from the former President Medvedev that suggest that Russia might be interested in looking after the interests of the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine, which is code for discovering alleged cases of discrimination against Russians and exerting pressure on the Ukrainian government as a result of that.
Both the US and Britain have warned President Vladimir Putin not to even consider using force to regain some sway over Ukraine. Is there any likelihood at all that Putin would consider doing this?
Well, we need to look at the historical precedent. I mean, the way in which Putin was successful in Georgia was, first of all, to identify parts of Georgia where there were sections of the population in whose name an intervention could be justified. And the result of that was the creation of these statelets of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are client states of the Russian Federation, and has effectively removed a significant part of Georgian sovereign territory. So Russia has form on this, recent form. It's development that we shouldn't lightly rule out.
Uncertain times for the Ukraine. That's it for tonight. Tomorrow on the show, we're off to...
Okay, well, there you go. That's what I can find out about Ukraine by listening to the radio for 1 hour in a tin hut under a tree on top of a ridge in Australia. Judging by that last fella who was just talking, it sounds a little bit like when Germany decided that it needed to go and look after the interests of ethnic Germans in the Danzig corridor in Poland. And in 1939, England and France declared war on Germany when Germany went to safeguard the interests of the ethnic Germans in the Danzig corridor in Poland. Does anybody honestly think that NATO is prepared to go to war against Russia if Putin suddenly discovers that there are some ethnic Russians who are being discriminated against in Ukraine? I don't think so. If Ukraine gets all of its energy from Russia, the Ukrainians are going to find that they will toe the line, or they'll go back to a muscle-powered economy and starve. On the bright side, the Ukrainians have once again demonstrated the same point the Tunisians and the Egyptians did the first time they had their rebellion, the Arab Spring, which is that if the civilians just sit down in a public place and refuse to be moved, and if the civilians who are rebelling don't actually engage in violence against the forces of military oppression, then even though they're going to suffer casualties, and in Ukraine 70-odd people got shot by snipers just for protesting, but then the snipers stopped pulling the trigger because they couldn't justify shooting up their own population, and the president is gone. The people who cause a shit fight are the ones who take up arms on behalf of the protesters, like what happened in Syria. It all sort of reminds me a fair bit of a passage in a book by Neville Shute, whose last name was Norway, called On the Beach, where a couple of blokes are sitting there talking about the Third World War. And one of them says, when the people in another country on the other side of the world decide that their national honour demands that they get up and attack somebody, not much you can do about it from the other side of the world. But maybe, he said, maybe it is our fault because we put up with newspapers that were full of sport and fashion and advertisements to buy shinier stuff. We didn't hold our media to account, and we didn't get our media to tell us what was really happening. Well, here in Australia, until Tony Abbott dismantles it, ABC Radio National still tells me, anyway, and anybody else who's listening, what's going on and why the best scholars on Ukrainian politics in Australia think what is happening is happening. But all I can say, Laura Leela, is I'm glad you're not going to go there for a holiday. 50% of the people who deal with the police over there have paid them a bribe in the last year. 21% of the people who've dealt with the judiciary have paid them a bribe in the last year. What was it, like 10% for the medical services and 15% for the educational services? It might be where one limb of your ancestral family tree was rooted, but You know, my father's people came from Yorkshire. You don't see me catching a plane to go and have a look at the north end of England, do you? Just make your garden grow where you are. That's a big enough challenge these days, I think. Right? And we'll let the Ukrainians sort out what's going to happen in Ukraine, because there's nothing that you can do from Cornwall or I can do from Australia. It's their issue. They'll have to deal with it. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.